Well, greetings, everybody. Welcome to another exciting lecture. And this one is going to be on one of the great avenues of the world. And this is London's Royal Avenue. That's me on the right on my not too long ago visit to London. In fact, I was there doing research and collecting information for this big PowerPoint presentation, this video. And I didn't realize that in Buckingham Palace, where the Royal Avenue begins, the Queen was in her 90s and would die within months after I left London. Well, then, not too long after that, there would be another major event on the Royal Avenue, and that would be the crowning of Charles III and Queen Camilla. So I was there just before the two biggest, most recent dramatic events that transpired on the Royal Avenue. And so it was really a very timely project to be undertaking, to be doing this Royal Avenue of London. Well, I have a series on the grand avenues of the world, whether it's Hollywood Boulevard, Fifth Avenue, Broadway, Paseo de la Reforma, Mexico City, of course, the Champs-Élysées, the Ringstrasse, in Vienna, the Nevsky Prospect, in St. Petersburg. Every great city has a glorious avenue. The glorious avenue is not, as the name implies, just another street. Although it can be. There's traffic all over on Fifth Avenue. Paseo de la Reforma is filled with traffic. But these grand avenues are also stages where dramatic, great events, ceremonies are performed. Think of Fifth Avenue, the St. Patrick's Day Parade or Gay Pride Parade. Not long ago, this past January, I was in Paris for the New Year's celebration on the Champs-Élysées. Well, I was always impressed with Times Square New Year's celebration, where you get 100,000 people or so. But in Paris, it was well over 1 million thronging the Champs-Élysées. So grand events are staged on these grand avenues of the world. Well, today's our Royal Avenue of London. First, the rise of Buckingham Palace. That's where the royal family lives. They haven't always lived there. In fact, somebody else lived there before the King and Queen took it over. But that's where the Royal Avenue begins, gradually emerging as the Palace of Buckingham grew in importance and as the British Empire grew in importance. Third will be a stage for royal events, weddings, recently the funeral, and not too far into the future, it will be the crowning of other kings and queens, as well as birthday celebrations, anniversaries, all kinds of royal events take place on the Royal Avenue. But then the Royal Avenue continues into the heart of London itself, where it becomes first the Strand, lined with monumental buildings, then Fleet and Cannon Streets, a continuation, and finally the Royal Avenue ends at the Tower of London. So if you look at point 1, Buckingham Palace, and point 6, the Tower of London, I'm sure we can all think of kings and queens who spent time in Buckingham Palace only to finish their years in the Tower of London. So it's sort of a dawn to dusk, life to death avenue. But it is one of the most exciting grand avenues of the world. So let's get going on our visit. Well, on this map, we can see basically downtown London. Well, almost in the middle of the picture, a little bit towards the bottom and towards the left, you can pick out the square, rectangular Buckingham Palace. In front, we see the Queen Victoria Memorial. That's where the palace grounds end, and it moves into the mall. Now, I was corrected when I was in London. It's not pronounced mall as an American would, but it's pronounced mall. So I will try to keep my language pure. Well, you go through the Admiralty Arch, which you see, and then you get to Trafalgar Square, which continues down with the royal courts and all kinds of stuff. Then you get to Fleet Street, where you see the magnificent St. Paul's Cathedral. Then it turns into Cannon Street, which goes down to finally the Tower of London and the Tower Bridge. So it is sort of a crescent going from the Tower of London back to Buckingham Palace. Curves around. But that is really a microcosm of British and English and London history. So let's begin our visit. Well, just beside Buckingham Palace is a palace which is even older, and this is St. James Palace. This was the official residence of the royal family from the 1530s under Henry VIII until 1837, when the family moved into Buckingham Palace. Well, St. James Palace, as you can see from the picture, is old, going back to the 1500s. This was the official residence of the royal family for hundreds of years. In fact, the American ambassador to England is not the American ambassador to England. He is the American ambassador to the court of St. James. So even though the court is no longer in St. James Palace, it has moved to Buckingham, still the official title of the American ambassador is to the court of St. James. And that building is still standing. It's off to the side of Buckingham Palace. It's sort of, as you can see, rooms, towers added on here and there. But it is a very important structure. Well, along St. James Palace, there was a park laid out, and that became known as St. James Park. It was purchased by Henry VIII when he was living in St. James Palace. It was at times called the French Park, because as you can see, the lines are straight. Everything is rectangular or square. This is a typical French formal garden. Now, the English gardens are sort of like Central Park here in New York, where paths going up and down, turning right, turning left, curving here and curving there, trees planted wherever they want to. Whereas you can see from the St. James Park, it is straight lines, semicircles, straight lines for the trees. Typical French style. French invented pruning the hedge, meaning God didn't know what God was doing when he created shrubs. Thank God the French were able to come along and to correct all the mistakes that God made. Well, the Buckingham House was already there in the 1700s. It was not Buckingham Palace. because it was the private residence of John Sheffield, the first Duke of Buckingham. It was the Sheffield family house, and you see a picture of it on the right. These buildings have been demolished or incorporated into what is today Buckingham Palace. So back in the 1700s, the royal family was happily living in St. James Palace, and you had another nearby palace, which was called the Buckingham House, and this is where the Sheffield family lived. And that dates from 1703. And there you see the young John Sheffield painting. Well, King George III of the House of Hanover in Germany, like most of the Georges, hated English food, hated England, hated the weather, hated the English, and would bring over brides from Germany. So they could, like George the First, the Second, and the Third, could easily converse in German, drink German beer, eat German food, and live in a little bit of Germany in the heart of London. Well, King George III, I'm sure you all know him, he was the one who lost the colonies, which eventually became the United States of America. Well, in 1761, a while before the American Revolution, he chose as his wife Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, and she was a princess of the Kingdom of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. She came to London, and like George, she just hated everything that was English and really wanted to create a little bit of Germany. Well, she thought that George, her husband, had already become a little bit too English for her taste. And so she refused to live in St. James Palace with her husband. She wanted to have her own little pied-à-terre. And so King George III bought Buckingham House as a wedding gift for his new bride. So Buckingham House became the residence not of the king, who was still back at St. James, but of his new wife, Queen Charlotte. Well, Charlotte started taking the house that you can see in the picture on the right and adding rooms and turning it into a residence which she thought was appropriate for her new status as the Queen of England. The one thing she did was she laid out what is today the Mall, or the Mall. The Mall was named in honor of the sport, which we see the guys playing in the picture, which was called Pamal, which was a type of golf or hockey, or not hockey, but some game played with mallets and balls. And she laid out an area in front of her new residence. And here you see it on the right. You see that it was, at times, it was more of a garden than an avenue, but with walking areas on both sides. Well, gradually, nobles and important wealthy people started wanting to build their own residences near the St. James Palace and the emerging Buckingham Palace. And so along the left side, government buildings were being built, private residences were being built. On the right side of the mall, there were trees, and that is St. James Park, St. James Gardens. So gradually, under George III, the mall started taking shape. Well, here we see the growth of the mall. The bottom left-hand corner, you see Buckingham Palace, and then gradually the red-colored mall started emerging, buildings being built on both sides, but St. James Park remaining a park. And it extends from the palace down to the big monumental Admiralty Arch. Long, straight line, buildings on one side, park on the other, with the Buckingham Palace gradually being expanded and St. James Palace eventually being eclipsed. You can see almost in the middle of the picture, St. James Palace, where eventually both monarchs would move into wings of Buckingham Palace. So the mall officially is about half a mile long. Lovely walk, paved. Now it's no longer gardens, but it's filled with trees and flowers. So that's going to be the first stretch of the Royal Avenue. Duke Clarence, future King William IV, built his personal residence in the early 1800s. And here we see a picture of it. And this is today called the Clarence House Royal Residence, where until today, future kings or grown-up aristocrats of the royal family move into the Clarence House. On the left, we see Duke of Clarence, who became King William IV in all of his splendor. Well, as the kings and queens are all dressed up, they had to dress up their city as well. And so the buildings are built in monumental, beautiful style. At about the same time, the Carlton House Terrace was built. These were for official government functions. And you can see in the picture on the right, there is an extended area which has like a porch. That is a viewing platform where certain important people can gather and watch royal events taking place down along the mall. And here again, it's rather austere architecture. None of the Baroque architecture that you'd find in European continental palaces, much more somber. Along the mall, there are various monuments. We see the grand old Duke of York from the early 1800s. Well, you can see there were carriages and the men were all dressed up as soldiers, but the grand old Duke of York, who would promenade up and down the mall in his official uniform and with his soldiers, sort of got a bad reputation because these aristocrats, these rich kids, would dress up in their military finery, parade up and down the mall. But as the little poem said, the grand old Duke of York and his 10,000 men never fought in a battle. But yet, the Duke of York deserved a beautiful statue along the mall. The Lancaster House, another rather beautiful building, is the government wine cellar. Every royal family had to have its master of wine. This is today the headquarters of the Institute of Masters of Wine of the United Kingdom. Every official function had to have its display of fine wines. Well, every country, I didn't know, has its masters of wine, official government employees who are in charge of supplying wine for the royal family in London. The United States has 45 masters of wine, France only has 16. Maybe it's because all French wines are supposed to be superior. But these are the people, 208 masters of wine, who have their offices in this Lancaster House, which is the headquarters of the official wine tasters and wine experts. Well, Buckingham Palace continued to grow in importance. Wings were added on. Auditoriums were added. Bedrooms were added. The picture on the left, you see me standing in front of the entrance, which you see in the middle picture, the main entrance of the Buckingham Palace. Well, Queen Victoria decided that from 1837 on, Buckingham Palace would be the official residence of the British monarchy. No longer St. James Palace. It would be Buckingham Palace. So she lived there, and from her long reign, 1837 to 1901, Buckingham Palace became the official residence of the British royal family. Now, the Mall is not just a main street. It is, as I mentioned earlier, the stage for royal events. The Mall, it serves the same function as, for example, the picture on the right, the Champs-Élysées in Paris, the widest street in Paris, huge sidewalks, trees, as well as traffic lined with all kinds of famous buildings. These grand boulevards of Paris were designed by Georges-Eugène Haussmann, who rebuilt Paris and carved all of these grand boulevards, which we all admire in Paris. And this became the stage for royal events. Well, London, as you can see from the map on the right, is still a medieval city, even after the Great Fire of or just before the American Revolution. The English could not bring themselves to get rid of their old street grid. And so very few long, straight streets exist in London. They're constantly curving. Traffic is a nightmare. Parking is even worse. Well, the Mall gradually emerged as one of the few grand avenues, and its extension continuing through the city. Now, when George Washington designed Washington, D.C., or had it designed, he insisted that the grid plan was fine, like Manhattan, but there must be grand boulevards. The grandest of all is, of course, the Pennsylvania Avenue, going from the Capitol building down to the White House. And so Washington had its main street, its main avenue for funerals, military parades, birthdays, honoring, visiting dignitaries. London has its Mall, but the rest of London is a warren of medieval streets. So gradually, every major city had to have an avenue. The Ringstrasse in Vienna, when the city walls were demolished, a grand boulevard ringing the city, 360 degrees. Peter the Great built Nevsky Prospect, a street of palaces, a street of cathedrals, of museums, and a street for showing off the glory of the Romanov family. Well, gradually the Mall grew in importance. Here you see the famous Victoria Memorial, 1911. This was the grand monument in honor of Queen Victoria. The person who really transformed the mall into a grand access was Aston Webb, who designed many buildings to decorate the mall. So you see the mall, the red mall. Look at the street. The only place in England that is permitted to be paved in red. He lined it with palaces and monuments. And at the right, you see the Buckingham Palace all decorated with lights. Beautiful sight to see at night. Along the mall, other monuments were built. King George VI monument, the statue, and then Queen Elizabeth. First one, 1955, then Queen Elizabeth in 2009. Here again, two more monuments lining the mall, turning it into a grand boulevard. You had the buildings along the mall, the St. James Park on one side, and the buildings and monuments on the other side, going from Buckingham Palace, paved in red, until you get to the Admiralty Arches. This is the Department of the Admiralty, the people in charge of the English Navy. And don't forget, when it was built in 1900, 1912, the English had the largest navy in the world. It was the British Empire, including India and Burma, Hong Kong, Malaysia, huge colonies in the Middle East, and a third of Africa. So this was celebrating the importance of the English Navy. And so you walk down the mall, half a mile, and then you get to the Admiralty Arches. That's the main stretch, the most important stretch of the Royal Avenue. Here we see Queen Elizabeth II and the royal family return from trooping the color. Royal events with royal carriages, the flags, and this is looking from Buckingham Palace down at the end. You see one of the arches of the Admiralty Arches. Birthdays of the Queen celebrated April 21st, 2018 is the picture we see. In fact, many people say that the paving dates from 1953, when it was decided to paint the Royal Way red. Some people even argue that that is the origin of the phrase to paint the town red, meaning to change it into a glorious celebration. Coronation of Victoria, the very same carriage that Charles III and Camilla rode in when they went down the Royal Way to be crowned. Victory after World War I. Again, in the distance, you see the Admiralty Arch. Now, many people say that actually painting it red does not date from 1953, because if you look at this picture of Queen Victoria being crowned, it looks like the pavement is red. Some people say that it was painted red for special occasions, but then it was only permanently paved in red in 1950. So this is one of these Trivial Pursuit conundrums that I'll let you sort out. Today on that stretch of the mall, we have the London Marathon, we have bicycle races, and the gays and lesbians have been fighting for years now to be able to march along the mall on the British London Gay Pride Parade. So not everybody is welcome to celebrate on the mall, but hopefully the gays and lesbians and others will be allowed to do it in the future. Here we see the changing of the guard. another daily event in front of Buckingham Palace. The Queen's Platinum Jubilee in 2022, shortly before I got there. In fact, when I was there in 22, the Jubilee was being celebrated with exhibits and posters all over the place, museum exhibits. And there again, you see the Queen and her husband in the same gold carriage that was used by Charles III and Camilla just a couple weeks ago. Well, we leave the Mall and we enter the next stretch of the Royal Way, and this is the Strand. Look at the picture on the left. You see the Admiralty Arches, which is Trafalgar Square, and then continues sort of bending as it goes down towards St. Clement Church. And this is the continuation of the Royal Way. Right after the Admiralty Arch, where the red paved Royal Way ends, you have Trafalgar Square. This is in honor of Nelson's victory over Napoleon in the Great Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Now, Trafalgar Square dates from 1844, and we see the great monument of 1843. So that is a monumental location. At Trafalgar Square, there is the National Gallery, and that is the premier museum of London, right off of Trafalgar Square, founded in 1824, and the current building dating from 1838. Once again, this very austere Greek Revival architecture. Just off to the right of the National Gallery is another landmark. This is a 1726 St. Martin in the Fields, because in 1726, when it was built, the area around Trafalgar Square was still not heavily populated. This is a typical church. You see the Greek facade with the tower. This was copied by every city in the United States during the colonial era. Best example in New York City is St. Paul's Chapel on Broadway, which is an exact imitation of the famous St. Martin's in the Fields. Also, along the main street there, we see one of the most famous places on the Strand, and this is Thomas Twining's tea house. Thomas Twining, during the 1700s, as Britain was building its world empire, basically monopolized the English tea imports. England, don't forget, controlled Sierra Leone, it controlled India, Bangladesh, and the tea plantations of Africa, and he had a monopoly. And this is his little shop, which is still on the Strand, and you can buy even today Twining's English breakfast tea. And you see the main entrance, and up there on the right, that is good old Thomas Twining. The East India Company controlled everything in red that we see in the picture. The Indian Empire of Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Burma and Ceylon. The English, Malaysia, Australia, third of Africa. And so the English really controlled the tea industry. Now today, about almost 30% of the world's tea is produced in India. China, another 25%. And so these two countries still pretty well dominate the tea industry. And don't forget, the English also had Hong Kong, where Twinings also monopolized the export of Chinese tea. Now, tea is very important for us New Yorkers and for people from the East Coast, because not only Boston had its tea party, protesting the tax on tea, but New York and Philadelphia all had their own tea parties, protesting Mr. Twining's monopoly on the tea and his attempt to make as much money as he could from this monopoly. Another institution along the Strand is Simpson's, dating from 1828. Now, it is considered the premier location for English food. In fact, they advertise a hearty, traditional English breakfast, traditional English food, and Simpson's was described as a restful temple of English food. Well, as you can see from the picture on the right, when I was there, it had closed. And in fact, there were articles in the press. Would it ever reopen, or would it be turned into a McDonald's or something? The English are not famed for their food. In fact, someone once asked me why in English we don't have an expression for bon appetit. You know, guten Appetit, and German, every language has an expression you use to welcome somebody to a good meal. And I said, well, our English food tradition was so terrible that when you have an English meal, rather than saying bon appetit, you have to say good luck and hope that you survive the meal. But the building was still there. And of course, I got the picture, and I have no idea if it's going to reopen. And as I said, the press was debating whether it should open or simply phased out. Also along the Strand is the famous Somerset House. This is just off of the Strand, and you can see once again the Greek architecture, palaces, residences, today offices and stores and everything. This dates from right after the American Revolution. The Waldorf Hotel is along the Strand, dating from 1908. Probably know the story of the Astor family. John Jacob Astor, the richest man in the world when he died, or at least the richest man in the United States, a German immigrant from Bavaria who became fabulously wealthy. Well, his family ended up fighting over his money, and Willie Waldorf Astor ended up moving to London to get away from the rest of the family. Well, he went into the hotel business, and here you see the Waldorf Hotel in London. Waldorf was the town in Bavaria in Germany where the Astor family came from. That's why in New York there's the Waldorf Astoria, which were two separate hotels which became one. Well, Willie Astor was what we call a dollar prince. These were rich Americans, predominantly women, who went to Europe to find some rich duke or prince or even king who had a royal title but no money. Well, the merging of a royal title with American money transformed many wealthy American women into the famed dollar princesses. Willie Astor was a dollar prince when he was awarded the title of a viscount, which is of lower mobility. But Consuela Vanderbilt was probably the most famous that went to Europe, ended up becoming a duchess or a princess and living in a castle, which she had to redo the roof and paint the damn place because it was falling down. But at least she got her royal title, and people like Winston Churchill's family got enough money to put a new roof and restore their ancestral mansion. So this is an example of a dollar prince, which was one of the few. Most of them were dollar princesses. Also along the Strand are the Royal Courts of Justice. Here again, magnificent Gothic architecture. This would be the courthouse, the Supreme Court, our offices of the British Empire. You can still go in and view the main areas. It's still a great place to visit. Well, the Court of Justice is Gothic. Well, the British adopted this wild Gothic architecture as the official architectural style of the British Empire. And the picture on the left, you see the High Court of Calcutta. On the right, you see the Bombay Railroad Station. All this type of flamboyant English Victorian Gothic, which really became the style of the British Empire. If you want to see another great example, go to Ottawa, Canada. It's all built in Victorian Gothic piles of stone. Well, another great place to visit along the Strand is the Bloomberg Building, 2017. Well, very, very modern. But when you tear down a bunch of old buildings and you build a brand new skyscraper, such as this one, you have to dig a big foundation. When they were digging it, they went down quite deep and they discovered some of the ruins of the ancient London city built by the Romans in 60 AD. It was called Londinium, which is the origin of the name London. Below the Bloomberg Building, they discovered ruins of a Roman temple of Mithras, one of the major gods worshipped by the Romans. So even underground, there's a lot of history in London. Lloyd's of London at 222 on the Strand. The company dates from 1688. The building itself was built in 1883. Here again, this is the largest insurance company, many people say in the world. Giant ships, entire buildings are insured by Lloyd's of London. That is synonymous with elegance and with insurance companies around the world. And Lloyd's also shows how important the English pound is. Even when England joined the European community, it insisted on keeping its own currency. For many people, the American dollar, the English pound, the Swiss franc are considered the three most stable currencies. The euro has since joined them, and the Chinese are doing everything they can to establish the yuan as a major currency. Well, when Britain finally left Brexit, one of the reasons was that it said we don't want to be part of a larger community. We want to do it on our own with our pound, and we will become a major world power again. Well, Fleet Street gives on Cannon Street. So we started with the Mall. We went on to the Strand, and now we are the next extension, and this is Fleet and Cannon Streets. Well, on the right is the official church of the Royal Air Force. It was severely bombed, as you can see from the picture on the left. It was bombed during World War II. The original church is another Sir Christopher Wren edifice dating from 1682. It was totally rebuilt after the Blitz, after the World War II. And as you can see from the seal on the floor, this is where the Air Force holds major events, graduations, honors, ceremonies, retirements, and everything else. It is held in this church. The important thing about England is England does not have separation of church and state like the United States. England is an officially Protestant Church of England. Now, for Americans, we don't really appreciate what this means, but to have a Royal Air Force ceremony taking place in an Episcopal or an Anglican church would strike most Americans as saying, wait a minute, you're not mixing up the military and a particular church. But most of the countries of the world do not have separation of church and state. Think of Iran, the Islamic Republic, Saudi Arabia. Think of Israel, a Jewish state with Jewish stars and symbols all over the place, religious symbols. So you do not have separation of church and state in many countries, and England does not. And you get a real feel for the unity of church and state when you visit, for example, the Church of St. Clement Danes. Queen Elizabeth and now King Charles III are the supreme governors of the Church of England. The king is the defender of the faith. And so the King of England, King Charles, is the head of the Church of England. He has official role and title in religion, similar to Saudi Arabia or Israel, or as Donald Trump tried to do, to make America Christian again. Now, here again, this is forbidden by the American Constitution, the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting or an establishment of religion, meaning United States, in spite of Donald Trump, cannot declare itself a Protestant country or a Jewish country or a Muslim country. It is a secular state. Well, a little bit further, we come upon another fascinating area, and this is called the Temple. It is still called the Temple because originally it was the headquarters of the Knights Templar. These were the British knights who went off to liberate the Holy Land of Jesus from the Muslims and the Jews and return it to good Christian control. They have ruins, as you can see from the middle picture, of some of the knights and some of their leaders who went off to war, established the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem, and restored Jerusalem to its Christian control. So this is also a fascinating place to visit to get another aspect of the ancient history of London. Temple Bar, also along the Strand. Here we see again an event, Queen Victoria's, one of her processions in her golden chariot. There are monuments along Fleet and Cannon Street. Some of the arches are no longer there, and some of the towers are no longer there. We next get to St. Paul's Cathedral. Here again, we see the original St. Paul's Cathedral of 1087, when it was a Gothic church. And in the middle, we see the current St. Paul's Cathedral dating from 1710. Here again is the stage for royal events, where the Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897 got into her carriage at Buckingham Palace, went down the Mall, and down along Fleet and Cannon Streets to the heart of the city, getting to St. Paul's Chapel, where she would celebrate her Diamond Jubilee. Another very important monument. Well, when I was there, the Queen had just celebrated her famous Jubilee. And on June the 3rd, 2022, she went to the cathedral and she had her celebrations once again as the Supreme Governor of the Church of England and as the defender of the faith. Well, along Cannon Street, we get to a monument of the Great Fire of 1666. Well, the Great Fire of 1666 was viewed by many in the United States as God's punishment on London for not giving the Americans our independence. Well, the monument was built, but many people said that following the Great Fire of 1666, that would have been a perfect good time to rebuild London, to make it like Washington or Paris or Manhattan, to put in straight streets, wide streets, good for travel, good for transportation, for business, but it was never done. And the old street system remained. The picture on the right shows the burnt area. St. Paul's Cathedral was burned and was part of this new, the new area, which many people said should be rebuilt. Well, the Great Fire was viewed as God's punishment because don't forget, as you can see in the picture on the left, the English sailed into New York Harbor, kicked out the Dutch, and took over the city, renaming New Amsterdam New York. This happened in 1664. And so many Americans believe until today that the Great Fire of London was God's punishment on England for not letting us have our independence and making Americans fight a bloody revolution to get our freedom. So London never got its beautiful big boulevards. It remained a city of many boulevards. In fact, there are no major boulevards other than the Mall, which is not that important compared to something like the Champs-Élysées. But every street in London has a sort of its own character. Savile Row is for men's fashions. Downing Street is where the Prime Minister lives. If you want lights and electrical stuff, you go to Piccadilly Circus. Theaters are on West Street. Carnaby Street for good food and sex. Abbey Road, made famous by the Beatles. So London, more than any other city, has a plethora of unique streets, not dominated by a grid plan or any major boulevard. Well, as we go down Fleet and Cannon Street, we get to London Bridge, which is brand new bridge we can see in 1973. And across the river, we see the financial district. Well, that was the oldest bridge in London. As you can see in the picture in the bottom, it was a stone bridge going back to the Roman Empire. And it was built partly of wood and partly of stone and was constantly in disrepair. And so when the brand new bridge was built in 1973, suddenly there was no more danger of London Bridge falling down. And across the London Bridge, you see the city. And this is the financial hub of the city. Once again, skyscraper cluster, sort of like a Wall Street district with its famous building on the right. It's called the Gherkin in honor of the pickle. Well, along Fleet and Cannon Streets and the extension down to the Tower of London, we constantly see memorials to the past. Remember the old English telephone box? Well, most of them are still there. Some of them turned into displays of plastic flowers, decorative. The one on the right was in honor of the Queen's Jubilee, and you see a reproduction of her crown and pictures. Also in London, everywhere you go, since it is a rather confusing city to walk and you're always getting lost, they have these little pavilions that you see in the middle with a large map of exactly where you are and a smaller map showing where you might want to go, with directions of Trafalgar Square, Inner Temple, West End, Charing Cross subway station and train station. It's a very well-organized city for the walking tourist. Well, finally, we get down to the end of the Royal Way, and this is the Tower of London. Picture on the right shows the tower going back to the 1078 when the White Tower, that's the one at the bottom on the left, the little white rounded building, the oldest part. The inner area was built in 1190s, rebuilt 1287. The wharf along the Thames River was expanded in the 1300s. And it is really a phenomenal place to visit. As I said, many a king or a queen had started in Buckingham Palace and ended up in the Tower. The White Tower is where the people were sent to die. David II of Scotland, Henry VI of England, St. Thomas More, Anne Boleyn finished her days in the Tower, Thomas Cromwell the revolutionary, Elizabeth I. The last execution were the Cray twins, who had a rather terrible story, which we don't have time to go in now, but they were the last ones to be executed in the White Tower. Since 1994, the Tower is also the location of the Jewel House. Here we see one of the many crowns that the royal family has, the kings and queens, for different occasions. And as was made very clear when Charles III was crowned just a couple of weeks ago, it was noted that he was the head of state of independent countries such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Pakistan, Ceylon. He is also the King of Ireland, Scotland, even France. The royal family of England claiming to be related to the last kings of France, and by rights. They should be allowed to claim the throne of France if France ever restores the monarchy. So this is where all the crowns and crown jewels are kept. Now, I was there, as we can see, for the Platinum Jubilee of the Queen. Exhibits everywhere. Buckingham Palace had an exhibit. I was there in August 2022, at the same time as the Platinum Jubilee. Every museum, every hotel lobby had some type of exhibit or poster in honor of the Queen. Well, as I said, just shortly after I left, she passed, and then just recently, Charles became the new king. This was broadcast around the world. Everybody was watching it, and all of the pomp and circumstance which the English crown heads are the only ones who carry out all of this ceremonies anymore. Even the ancient ceremony of anointing the king with holy oil by the archbishop to show that he is not just the king of a country, he is the head of a worldwide religious organization, just like King David and Solomon were anointed with holy oil by the temple priests. So Charles was anointed with sacred oils by the archbishop. Once again, showing the links of the royal family to both church and state. And finally, we get to the Tower Bridge, which is a drawbridge. And this was built between 1886 and 1894. It's a thrilling sight to be there when you see it opening up to let some big ships go through. But it is also one of the great tourist sites of London. And London is very proud of its bridge. If you look at Tower Bridge, the late 1800s, don't forget this is the very same time that Brooklyn Bridge was being built with its unique, ultra-modern, experimental steel cables. Late 1800s was a golden age of steel building, of bridges, of the Eiffel Tower. And ultra-modern Brooklyn Bridge was part of this glorious bridge building era. Well, with the Brooklyn Bridge, it brings us to the end of our royal way. In spite of Brexit, in spite of questions about the future of Britain, in spite of its loss of its empire, the royal way is still the site of great and monumental events, ceremonies, and other celebrations along the royal way of London. And as we have seen, and we just saw with Charles III's coronation, and Queen Elizabeth III's funeral cortege, the royal way is still a major part of the history of grand avenues of the world. So once again, if you have any comments or ideas, let me know at ronbrownmedia@gmail.com. And I hope to see you sometime in the near future for another exciting lecture. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time.